In 2012, a man was arrested with $1 million in counterfeit U.S. cash. Federal agents told him he would die in prison. 18 months later, he walked free with a $4,300 fine after printing more fake American money than anyone in recorded history. May 14, 2012. A quiet suburb in Quebec, the kind of place where nothing ever seems to happen. A man steps out of his car and opens the trunk. Inside is a plain cardboard box. No markings, no locks, just taped shut. Inside the box, $1 million in US $20 bills. This isn't his first time. He's made handoffs like this dozens of times before. Routine, controlled, quiet. What he doesn't know is that the modest bungalow he's walking isn't empty. It's filled with 12 federal agents, members of a joint task force from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the United States Secret Service. The moment the box is opened, everything detonates. Flashbang grenades explode through the house. Doors and windows burst open simultaneously. Armed officers flood in from every direction, shouting commands in French and English. The man is driven face first into the floor. His wrists are zip-tied behind his back. His head is pressed into the carpet as boots pin his shoulders down. Within minutes, he's hearing the words that end most lives permanently: industrial, scale counterfeiting, federal charges, extradition to the United States. A Secret Service agent leans close and speaks quietly, almost casually. Under U.S. sentencing guidelines, the scale of this operation carries exposure of up to 60 years in prison, possibly ADX Florence. The Supermax facility, where inmates spend 23 hours a day alone in concrete cells. In that moment, this case looks simple. A man has been caught red-handed moving counterfeit U.S. currency. The evidence is physical. The charges are overwhelming. The sentence appears inevitable. But what no one in that house understands yet, not the agents, not the prosecutors, not even the men preparing the arrest report, is that this will not end in a prison sentence. Because this man has already done something no counterfeiter in history has ever accomplished. He has printed more counterfeit US dollars than anyone on record. Over 250 million in near-perfect 20 bills and $1,000 bills, and hidden almost all of it beyond the reach of law enforcement. And within 18 months of this arrest, instead of entering a federal penitentiary, he will walk out of court a free man. His punishment will be a $4,300 fine. To understand how that outcome was even possible, investigators would later realize they had to go back years, to a cramped apartment outside Montreal, a single worn-out $20 bill, and a question no counterfeiter had ever dared to ask. November 2008, a rented apartment on the outskirts of Montreal. The space is small and cluttered, barely furnished. On a desk, pushed against the wall, a single desk lamp casts a tight circle of light. Sitting beneath it is a man with a magnifying loupe pressed to his eye. His name is Frank Barassa. Pinned under the glass is a worn US $20 bill. Frank has been staring at this note for 47 consecutive days. Not casually, not out of curiosity, with methodical, almost clinical attention. He knows the placement of every printed word woven into Andrew Jackson's collar. He has memorized the exact way the numeral in the lower right corner shifts from green to copper when the angle changes. He has measured the security thread to the millimeter, 1.2 inches from the left edge, embedded precisely between the second and third printing layers. Frank is not a master engraver. He is not a chemist. He does not have a degree in printing or materials science. He is a high school dropout from Troyes, Riviera who made his early money selling stolen car parts and low-grade marijuana. But Frank has two qualities that separate the criminals who fail from the ones who succeed. The first is obsessive patience, the ability to sit with a single problem for weeks without moving forward. The second is an instinct for identifying the one failure point everyone else ignores. Every counterfeiter before him has followed the same path. They focus on the ink, the printing process, the holograms, the micro details meant to defeat machines. And every one of them fails for the same reason, not because their bills look wrong, but because they feel wrong. Frank understands this early. The fatal flaw in counterfeit U.S. currency isn't visual, it's tactile. U.S. money isn't printed on paper at all, it's printed on fabric. A blend of 75% cotton and 25% linen. That fabric is manufactured by exactly one company on Earth, Crane Currency, based in Dalton, Massachusetts. They've held the U.S. contract since 1879. The formula is classified. The facility is guarded. Every sheet is tracked from production to printing. If you don't have that material, nothing else matters. A cashier doesn't need training to spot a fake. They feel it. And that realization forces Frank to confront a truth that ends most counterfeit operations before they begin. You can't buy this paper. You can't steal it. And you can't make it. At least, not the way everyone else has tried. So, Frank stops asking how to replicate U.S. currency and starts asking a different question. For decades, the United States designed its currency around a single assumption, that no criminal could ever access the paper itself. The fabric used in U.S. banknotes isn't just rare. It's deliberately unobtainable. The blend, 75% cotton, 25% linen, is produced under federal contract by Crane Currency in Massachusetts. The process is tightly controlled. The formula is classified. Federal agents oversee production. Every sheet is tracked from the moment it's made until it's destroyed or printed. There is no surplus, no aftermarket, no leakage. That control creates a simple but powerful defense. You can counterfeit the ink. You can approximate the printing. You can even fool machines for a short time. But you can't fool human touch. A real U.S. bill feels wrong the moment it's fake. Cashiers don't need training manuals or UV lamps. They know instantly because the texture is off, too smooth, too soft, too stiff. This is why every major counterfeiting operation eventually collapses. Not at the printing stage, but at the moment of circulation. Frank understands this better than most. As he studies the $20 bill under his magnifying loupe, he isn't looking at the visible features. He's thinking about supply chains. Because while U.S. currency paper is exclusive, currency-grade cotton, linen fabric itself is not uniquely American. Central banks around the world use similar materials. Government bond printers, security document manufacturers, and specialty mills legally produce high-grade rag paper every day, not for criminals, but for states, and those mills operate on trust. They sell to corporations, governments, and financial institutions that place specialized orders under legitimate cover, which leads Frank to the conclusion no counterfeiter, before him, was willing to explore. The problem isn't making the paper. The problem is convincing the right people to make it for you. If he could appear legitimate, not as a criminal, but as a corporate buyer with a plausible need, the single obstacle that made U.S. counterfeiting impossible might disappear entirely. It's a plan that shouldn't work, and one that would collapse instantly under real scrutiny. But Frank isn't trying to defeat a machine. He's trying to exploit human compliance. Frank doesn't begin by placing an order. He begins by building a persona. If he's going to ask legitimate manufacturers for something no criminal should ever possess, he can't sound desperate, specific, or impatient. He has to sound boring. In December 2008, Frank starts cold calling specialty paper mills across Europe under a fabricated identity. Jackson Maxwell, Procurement Director. Keystone Investments Limited. The pitch is deliberately unremarkable. His firm, he explains, is preparing to issue high-security corporate bonds. They need premium rag paper with embedded anti-counterfeiting features. It's technical enough to sound legitimate, vague enough to avoid scrutiny. The response is immediate and discouraging. The first 23 mills hang up on him. Some laugh. A few threaten to notify authorities. Frank doesn't argue. He doesn't panic. He recalibrates. He registers a London callback number. He builds a professional website for Keystone Investments. He has corporate letterhead printed. Then he changes targets. Instead of calling large, highly regulated manufacturers, he focuses on smaller specialty mills, companies accustomed to unusual requests from government and financial clients. By early February 2009, that strategy pays off. On February 3, 2009, A small Swiss firm named Ardos agrees to continue the conversation. Frank keeps his voice steady as he thanks them and promises to send specifications. When the call ends, he doesn't sleep for 2 days, because a door has just opened that no counterfeiter has ever walked through. But Frank understands the danger. Asking for everything at once would trigger alarms. So he breaks the request into pieces. First, the blend is 75% cotton, 25% linen. Ardos confirms they can produce it. Next, chemical treatment to defeat iodine detection pens. Unusual, but technically feasible. Then a custom watermark embedded directly into the paper fibers. Ardos asks for a design. Frank complies. Finally, he makes the most dangerous request of all. A polymer security thread, woven into the paper and micro, printed with the text, USA 20 point. Frank explains that it represents the bond denomination. Ardos agrees. The quote arrives soon after, $35 for a custom watermark cylinder, to be manufactured in Germany and shipped to Switzerland. Frank wires the money immediately through a network of shell companies. At this point, there's no turning back. One suspicious employee. One compliance officer asking the wrong question. One internal audit. And Frank is in handcuffs before a single sheet is ever produced. But for the first time in the history of U.S. counterfeiting, a legitimate paper mill is preparing to manufacture currency, grade stock for a private individual. And no one in law enforcement knows it exists. By late summer of 2009, the process is complete. Ardos has received every specification. The custom watermark cylinder has been manufactured in Germany and installed. The polymer security thread has been approved. The chemical treatments have been finalized. Nothing about the order appears overtly criminal on paper. In September 2009, Frank places the final request. He doesn't ask for a test batch. He doesn't hedge. He orders enough paper to support the printing of $250 million in U.S. $20 bills. The entire projected output of his operation, committed in a single purchase. The invoice arrives shortly after. The 50,000. It represents every dollar Frank has saved or stolen over the past 15 years. If this shipment arrives safely, Frank becomes the most prolific counterfeiter in American history. If it's intercepted, he faces decades in prison before he ever prints a single bill. There is no backup plan. In November 2009, 5 pallets of currency, grade paper, leave Switzerland, packed in unmarked crates and loaded into a shipping container bound for Montreal. The destination is a man who does not exist, operating through paperwork that will not survive real scrutiny. And once the container enters Canadian customs, Frank loses control. Customs officers do not need warrants. They do not need suspicion. Any container can be opened at random. If an inspector cuts the seal and removes a single sheet, everything collapses. They will feel the texture instantly. They will hold it to the light. And Andrew Jackson's face will appear in the fibers. Frank understands something else, too. The operation already has a flaw. A small one, easy to miss, but visible to anyone paying attention. It won't stop the paper from arriving. But years later, it will become the first thread investigators pull, the mistake that eventually brings the Secret Service to his door. December 7, 2009, the Port of Montreal. From a concrete parking structure 300 meters away, Frank watches the container yard through binoculars, his hands unsteady. Somewhere in that maze of stacked metal boxes sits his future. 5 pallets of specialty paper, packed inside unmarked crates, cleared under a falsified commercial invoice, labeled innocuously as specialty paper products. At this stage, nothing is under Frank's control. Canadian customs officers don't need warrants. They don't need probable cause. Any container can be selected for inspection at random. If an inspector cuts the seal and pulls out even one sheet, the operation ends instantly. The texture alone would give it away. Held to the light, the watermark would appear. Andrew Jackson's face, woven into the fibers. Frank has prepared as much as preparation allows. For 3 days, he and 2 associates run surveillance in shifts. They memorize patrol patterns. Track which inspectors work which zones. Note how long spot checks typically last. They map 3 escape routes from the port. They prepare a cover story. One that wouldn't survive real questioning, but might buy enough time to disappear. None of it matters if the container is opened. Hours pass. Then something Frank has no control over happens. The container clears without inspection. Frank doesn't celebrate. He doesn't move. He doesn't even breathe properly until the truck carrying the shipment is 40 kilometers from the port, winding through back roads toward a rented warehouse in Troyes, Riviera. Even then, he waits. For 4 days, the container sits untouched. Frank drives past the warehouse at irregular intervals, scanning for unmarked vehicles, watching for surveillance teams. Only when he's convinced no one is watching does he cut the seal. Inside, the paper looks ordinary. Off-white sheets. Unprinted. Unremarkable. But the moment Frank touches it, he knows. The texture is perfect. Grainy. Firm. Nothing like commercial stock. He holds a sheet up to the light. Andrew Jackson's face materializes in the fibers. Ghostly and precise. A polymer security thread runs vertically through the paper. Micro, printed with USA 20 point. He snaps the sheet between his hands. The sound is identical to a real bill. In that moment, a line is crossed. A legitimate paper mill has just manufactured U.S. banknote stock for a private citizen. No government agency knows it exists. No serial numbers track it. No safeguards account for it. Frank now has something no counterfeiter in history has ever possessed. The canvas. But he still doesn't have the painting. Having the paper solves only one problem. To turn it into money, Frank needs something that exists almost exclusively inside government facilities. A private mint. Capable of industrial-scale production. This is where most counterfeit operations collapse. They rely on consumer printers. They produce a few $1,000s. They pass bills one at a time at gas stations and restaurants. Frank is not interested in thousands. He wants hundreds of millions. That requires equipment worth more than most houses, expertise he doesn't have, and a facility invisible to neighbors, police, and even satellite surveillance. In January 2010, Frank finds it. An abandoned barn on a 40-acre farm outside Troyes, Riviera. He pays in cash. Registers the property under a fake name. From the outside, it looks like a storage building. Inside, it becomes something else entirely. The centerpiece of the operation is a 4-color Heidelberg offset press, the same type used by legitimate currency printers around the world. Frank buys it secondhand from a bankrupt print shop for $125 in cash. The machine weighs 6 tons. Moving it requires a flatbed truck, a rented crane, and 4 men who believe they're relocating equipment for a packaging company. Alongside the Heidelberg, Frank installs industrial dryers, precision cutting machines, UV curing stations, and a custom stamping apparatus for applying color, shifting foil. He sources specialty inks from suppliers across 3 continents. Color, shifting metallics, UV reactive compounds, and the exact gray-green formulation used by the U.S. Bureau of Engraving and Printing. The total investment reaches $300,000. Every dollar Frank has ever made, stolen, or borrowed is now sitting inside a rural barn in Quebec. If this works, he prints a fortune. If it fails, he loses everything. And almost certainly his freedom. There's one more problem. Frank doesn't know how to run any of it. Offset printing at this level takes years to master. Color calibration alone can take months. One incorrect setting, and the output is obviously fake. So, Frank does what he's done at every critical point. He finds someone who can be bought. Through underworld connections, he recruits a skilled press operator, a man who previously ran a legitimate print shop before serving time for an unrelated offense. This man becomes Frank's technical director. He teaches him ink density, plate alignment, registration tolerances, the thousands of small details that separate amateur counterfeits from supernotes. The first test runs are disasters. Colors too saturated. Registration off by fractions of a millimeter. Security features misaligned. Frank burns every failed sheet. For 3 months, he produces nothing but garbage. The pressure becomes constant. Every day the operation runs is another chance for discovery. A neighbor asking questions. A supplier noticing something unusual. A routine traffic stop that goes in the wrong direction. Frank is bleeding money he no longer has, waiting for a breakthrough that may never come. Then, in April 2010, it happens. The Heidelberg produces its first perfect $20 bill. Frank holds it next to a genuine note. He can't tell the difference. Neither can the UV lamp, the iodine pen, or the magnifying loupe. The watermark is flawless. The color, shifting ink transitions from copper to green at the correct angle. The paper snaps exactly right. For the first time, Frank isn't imagining success. He's holding it. By December 2010, Frank has achieved what no counterfeiter before him has accomplished. He has printed 12.5 million $20 bills, a total face value of $250 million. The bills fill 47 wooden crates stacked inside a secondary barn on the property. It is more counterfeit U.S. currency than the Secret Service has ever seized in a single operation. But printing is only half the battle. The difference between amateurs and professionals is distribution. Amateurs pass bills at gas stations, convenience stores, and restaurants. Within weeks they are caught. Camera witnesses. Serial number tracking. Professionals operate wholesale. Frank doesn't spend his counterfeit. He sells it in bulk to criminal organizations at a steep discount, collecting clean money in return. The rate is simple: 30 cents on the dollar. For every $1 million in fake 20s, he charges a 300,000 in real currency. Because the bills are so perfect, buyers line up. He sells through a single trusted middleman to organized crime contacts in 3 countries. The rules are strict. No distribution in Canada. Nothing in the northeastern United States. Bills must enter circulation overseas first. Europe, Asia. Anywhere that delays pattern detection. A fake 20 spent in Prague creates no investigative trail back to Quebec. Between 2010 and 2012, Frank moves approximately $50 million in counterfeit currency. His cut, or $15 million in legitimate cash, flows into offshore accounts in Panama and the Cayman Islands. He buys nothing flashy. He maintains the same apartment, drives the same truck. The only visible change, he stops selling marijuana. No reason to risk a drug charge when sitting on millions. But even the most meticulous operations have vulnerabilities. By March 2012, a bank teller in Las Vegas notices something strange. 11 $20 bills in a single deposit share identical serial numbers. These are not Frank's duplicates. He never repeats serials. Someone in his distribution chain has made the mistake he spent years avoiding. The Secret Service opens a formal investigation. Operation Sunset. Initially, analysts suspect a foreign government. The quality of the bills is too high for any known criminal enterprise. These aren't basement fakes. They are supernotes, the kind only a state or highly skilled operation could produce. Then, Canadian authorities seize a batch in a drug raid near Montreal, connecting the investigation to a known mob associate. The Secret Service quietly established a joint task force with the RCMP, tracing distribution patterns, flipping low-level couriers, and mapping the money back toward its source. By late 2012, they know a major counterfeiting operation is underway in Quebec. They know it's producing millions in counterfeit in 20 bills. They just don't know where or who. One of Frank's 3 wholesale buyers is arrested on unrelated charges. The first domino falls, and the investigation now has a potential road to the source. May 14, 2012. A quiet bungalow outside Troyes, Riviera. Frank arrives carrying a cardboard box. Inside $1 million in counterfeit $20 bills. His largest single transaction ever. The buyer is a man Frank has never met. Introduced through an intermediary as a representative of an Ontario biker organization with European distribution contacts. The buyer seems professional. He asks the right questions. He knows the terminology. What Frank doesn't know is that the man is an undercover RCMP officer, part of a joint task force with 3 U.S. Secret Service agents. They have been building this case for 4 months. Frank enters the bungalow. He is greeted politely. He sets the box down. He quotes his standard rate, or 300,000 for the million. A single word is spoken confirmed. Then chaos erupts. Flashbang Golan grenades detonate in the kitchen and hallway. Tactical teams storm from every entrance, shouting in French and English. Frank hits the floor before processing what's happening. His face is pressed into the carpet. Wrists zip, tied behind his back. 2 officers pin his shoulders. Minutes later, a second team raids the barn. Inside they find the Heidelberg press still warm from a production run earlier that morning. Cutting equipment. Ink barrels. Printing plates. $1 million in finished counterfeit bills. $2 million in uncut sheets. But they do not find the remaining $200 million, stored elsewhere. A secret only Frank knows. At RCMP headquarters, the interrogation begins. Canadian charges alone carry up to 14 years. Under U.S. federal law, Frank faces 60 years, ADX Florence. Supermax solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. Frank asks for a lawyer. Then, he stops talking. For 18 months, he sits in a Montreal detention facility while prosecutors assemble their case, and the U.S. files extradition paperwork. The Secret Service has seized his equipment. They've dismantled his distribution network. They've arrested 14 associates across 3 countries, but they've recovered less than 2% of his total output. The remaining $200 million in supernotes sits hidden, a ticking threat to the integrity of the U.S. dollar. Frank understands what Washington must also realize. If he goes to prison, the money will surface. His associates will sell it. It will flood global currency markets. Confidence in the dollar would be shattered. And Frank is the only man who can control it. In his cell, Frank begins calculating leverage. The U.S. has his presses. They've arrested his associates. They've dismantled his network. They've built a case that could put him in prison for decades. But the $200 million in supernotes remains untouched. Hidden in a location only Frank knows. He drafts a proposal. He will reveal the location of every remaining note. He will surrender his backup printing plates. In exchange, charges reduced to a single count of minor counterfeiting. Time served. 6 weeks. The U.S. will withdraw its extradition request. His public defender calls it delusional. The government does not negotiate with counterfeiting criminals. Frank smiles. The U.S. has never dealt with a counterfeiter capable of threatening their currency supply from inside a prison cell. Weeks pass before the scheduled handover. Frank anticipates surveillance. He arranges for an associate with no criminal record to relocate the remaining counterfeit currency. 10 large boxes are loaded into a commercial box truck and stored behind an abandoned motel off Highway 40. Frank never visits the site. He never even glances in its direction. December 3, 2013. A conference room in Montreal's Palais de Justice. Frank sits across from 4 attorneys, 2 Canadian prosecutors, 1 U.S. assistant attorney, his public defender. The extradition hearing is scheduled for the following week. His lawyer presents the proposal. The room is silent for 11 seconds. Then the U.S. attorney laughs. The proposal is absurd, he says. Counterfeiting is a federal crime with mandatory sentencing guidelines. Negotiating sets a dangerous precedent. Frank interrupts calmly. 200 million in undetectable supernotes sits in a location only I know. If extradited, that money remains hidden. Over 18 months, it could enter global markets. Asia, Europe, the Americas. Confidence in the dollar would be decimated. Suddenly, the U.S. attorney stops laughing. Negotiations continue for 6 weeks. Federal agents debate the acceptable sentence for a counterfeiter, while the man holding their currency hostage sits across the table. By January 2014, an agreement is reached. Frank pleaded to a single Canadian count. Time served 6 weeks. Fine fondated $300. U.S. withdraws extradition. Frank surrenders 200 million in supernotes, backup printing plates, and a secondary Heidelberg press. Even in the 4 weeks before the handover, Frank's planning ensures law enforcement cannot seize the money prematurely. January 31, 2014. The day of the handover, Frank is escorted in a convoy of unmarked vehicles to the abandoned motel parking lot. He directs the officers to a rusted box truck in the corner. An RCMP sergeant hands him bolt cutters. Frank snaps the padlock. He swings open the doors. Inside cardboard boxes, shrink-wrapped bundles of $20 bills. Investigators stare in silence. One climbs inside, slices open a box, and examines a note under portable UV light. The watermark is perfect. The polymer security thread fluoresces correctly. The color, shifting ink transitions from copper to green at exactly the right angle. These are Frank's supernotes, the largest single seizure of counterfeit American currency in history. It takes 4 hours and 3 additional trucks to transport the money to a secure RCMP facility for cataloging and destruction. Frank watches from beside his lawyer's sedan, arms crossed. A faint smile visible in photographs taken by a journalist tipped off anonymously. 2 months later, Frank pays his $300 fine in real cash and walks out of the Montreal courthouse. Reporters ask if he has regrets. He shrugs. He is already consulting security firms on anti-counterfeiting measures. The man who printed 250 million in supernotes now advises governments on how to stop people like himself. For the Secret Service agents who spent 3 years building the case, he becomes a cautionary tale. Too sophisticated to prosecute, too brazen to ignore, too dangerous to incarcerate, too valuable to eliminate. Frank remains in Quebec. He has never been charged with another crime. The supernotes he printed continued circulating for years after his arrest. Estimates suggest 50 million in face value remains unrecovered, moving through global economies undetected. In response, the U.S. Treasury redesigned the $20 bill twice, adding features specifically to prevent another Frank Bourassa. Whether these measures could stop him is a question no one in Washington wants to answer. And if you think Frank's escape was audacious, consider this: the North Korean operation that printed 100 million in perfect American hundreds using equipment stolen from the U.S. Government itself makes even Frank look like an amateur. The man who walked out of a Montreal courthouse for 6 weeks and a $300 fine will long remain a study in criminal genius and audacious leverage.